Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be moderating this panel on corporate governance, conflict of interest, and disclosure. First of all, I want to thank Scott and Megan for organizing this terrific conference. And I must say, I'm personally really pleased that, that we have this conference dedicated to PhD students and presentations by PhD students. And the students are working on issues that relate to financial markets and have implications for policy also. I think we need so much work in that area. So it was fantastic to attend the panel before, led by Professor Jeff Coles, and 3 great papers were presented. So, but let's get going with our panel. And I encourage anyone, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in chat, and I'll take them up as the questions come at the appropriate time. So let me start with asking our 3 panelists to introduce themselves and give a little bit of background in terms of what they do. And we have Professor Kothari, who has a lot of experience, obviously in academia, but also on the regulatory and policy side. And then we have Mattias Nilsson, who is at the SEC currently, working on a lot of the issues that the SEC is dealing with and has their plate full. And we're delighted to have Ed Knight. Ed is at Nasdaq. He'll tell us more about himself, but also was in the administration, in a prior administration. So he sort of has definitely the both of the regulatory policy side and the private sector and exchanges viewpoint. So Ed, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Sure. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you today. And NASDAQ, I have to say, owes a debt of gratitude to, in essence, the institutions that our 2 other panelists that will be participating today represent, and that's good regulation and research-based universities. Without that, we wouldn't be NASDAQ. Larry Summers, I've heard him say when asked, why does the United States have such an innovative and growing economy? He says it's really not the United States, it's about 10 states. And that's where the great research universities are located, like the University of Texas and Georgetown and many others. But I have been at NASDAQ for 22 years. I'm currently the vice chairman. I've spent 20 years as the chief regulatory officer and general counsel. Before that, I was at the U.S. Treasury Department 5 years, 7 years there, 5 years as their general counsel under the Clinton administration. So that's my background, briefly put.
Thank you, Ed. Mattias, you are next on my screen.
All right. So my name is Mattias Nilsson. So I am at the SEC. So before I say something further, let me just say that my remarks today will reflect solely my personal views and not those of the Securities and Exchange Commission, individual members of the Commission, or its staff. And clearly they will disclaim any responsibility for whatever I say today. So, so that's the first start. So I work with as a financial economist in the Office of Corporate Finance at the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis at the Commission, and I've been here 6 years now. So we deal with economic analysis. Our main duty is to deal with economic analysis of proposed rulemakings and those that are up for adoption. But we, of course, provide all sorts of background research too in that process and advice on all sorts of other regulatory matters that come before us. And in particular, then I work in the space of corporate finance, which is very broad in the Commission. My own special interest is in governance and disclosure, so I guess I'm a good fit in that sense for this session. Prior to coming to the Commission, I was in academia. I was an assistant professor right before coming to the SEC, assistant professor of finance at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where I was heavily involved in the PhD program, including teaching, and also for 1 year I served as the director of the program. So being in this kind of setting is near and dear to my heart. I really enjoyed that portion of my academic life. So thank you for having me here.
And SB?
Thank you, Reena, and thank you, University of Texas, Austin, Scott Bogus in particular, for organizing it, and delighted to be part of this panel. I'm a professor of accounting and finance at MIT Sloan School of Management. I have been here for more than 2 decades. And during this time, I have engaged in research on disclosure issues, valuation, market efficiency, and corporate governance. In addition to that, I serve on a few private and public boards, take part in their IPO process, in compensation and audit committees. I also, for 2 years, served as SEC's chief economist from 2019 to 2021. And during that time, I had the pleasure of working with Mattias, so a great guy. Finally, I will say that I worked at Barclays Global Investors in 2008 and 2009. My timing was not very good, but I was managing a large active equity portfolio as global head of equity research. So once again, thank you, Reena, for the opportunity.
Well, thank you to each of you for joining us today. And the audience here, they're sort of the future of our profession, and they're the leaders who will be working on the important issues for the next several decades. And the last session that Jeff Coles was chairing and moderating, we finished the session with a paper on diversity on boards. So let me start with the sort of big news of the last few days, which is the Nasdaq diversity proposal getting the blessing of the SEC. And so I'm going to ask Ed. Ed, can you talk briefly about, give us the background on the proposal, the guidelines there, the disclosure that's being asked for, and giving us a sense of who was in favor of this? What were comments that you got that made you tweak some things? So any background that you could provide would be great.
All right. I think it's important to understand what Nasdaq is and how it's different than other financial institutions. So across the street from Nasdaq's headquarters in Times Square is the headquarters of Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley trades securities. They have their trading floor there, right at Times Square. But they're a private bank, and they don't have to do business with you. And they can discriminate, in essence, in how they price products to you. And they can be dark in how they operate. Nasdaq has a license that it received from the SEC and from the federal government, which requires it to operate an open, transparent public market according to the rules that the SEC promulgates and according to our own rules. And we're in return to that license, we have an obligation to continue to run a fair and orderly market and to perfect that market, and to run it in a non-discriminatory way. And we propose on an annual basis, in average, about 400 rule changes to the SEC for their approval. And one of the areas which we have for decades written rules is around corporate governance and around board composition and population. And in the last few years, we have increasingly heard from institutional investors and a wide range of investors and interest groups, civil rights groups, that boards would perform better and that investors want more information about the population of those boards and the makeup of those boards and whether underrepresented minorities are on that board and whether women are on the boards. And there was not a consistent set of information about it, even provided to us on a confidential basis. There was some information, but it wasn't consistently laid out. And we were hearing increasingly that it would take decades at the rate boards were populating themselves and making changes before they would reflect the makeup of our society. And that boards would operate better, and in particular, manage risk better if they were more diverse. So we made a proposal that, frankly, we started working on it a couple of years ago. And our proposal, in essence, says that all companies who list with Nasdaq must submit information, and we give them a variety of different ways they can disclose it, but according to a matrix which indicates the population of their board and whether the directors themselves on a voluntary basis have identified themselves as men, women, members of underrepresented minorities, or the LGBTQ community. In addition, we have laid out an aspirational standard that we ask the boards to try to reach within, depending upon the size of the company, 4 to 5 years from the SEC approval. And that would be to include one woman on their board and one underrepresented minority or LGBTQ community member. If they choose not to, they may merely state why they choose not to. They don't have to state a policy. They just need to state their reason. And we are not going to subjectively evaluate that reason, but they must submit a reason why they have taken a different path or have included other groups that they think are important, like just to name two, veterans or the disabled community. So that's the standard. We received over 200 public written comments on this. Over 80% were positive from a wide range of investors, law firms, civil rights groups, organized labor, and other NGOs, as well as large financial institutions like Goldman Sachs. It was opposed by Judicial Watch, the Heritage Foundation, and some members of the House of the Senate Banking Committee, Republican members of the Banking Committee. But that's it in a nutshell, and I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you for that background, Ed. So this group of PhD students, many of them are working on projects related to board diversity, and they're looking for additional interesting issues to examine. So let me turn to SP and Mattias and ask you, so the Nasdaq guidelines, now that they're approved, what kinds of issues do you think need to be researched that the academic community can contribute to? What are the questions that need to be answered, and that sort of this new data and implementation of these guidelines will provide? And so what should our PhD students be thinking about?
Happy to. First, I think it is important that anybody who either supports or opposes or raises some questions are not viewed as against women or against minorities. I think it is very important. I think there is an underlying tone here that anybody who opposes is somehow is against that. And I think we have to get past that. So that is first. Second, I think the proposal, let us just say, either minority or women, should have or are encouraged to disclose that they have. There has to be some objective, right? And I think from a research standpoint, it is worthwhile then asking, well, is that objective being fulfilled or not? One objective might be that, well, performance is improved. Second objective might be that risk is better managed. Third objective might be that, well, right now, these groups are being discriminated against, and that's why we need some certain number of representation to overcome that discrimination. So it has to be some basis, some economic rationale as to why we are proposing this. And I think research can help in addressing that issue. Okay, so I think that's what I encourage. So to start with, why do we expect that diversity to be helpful? And that has to be economically explained, because we do observe a lot of lack of diversity in a lot of fields. I mean, it's I can go over the tech sector. MIT has been admitting 50% men and women for at least last 20 years. And there is no restriction on how many of them can take a particular course. And yet the computer science is vastly populated by men, and whereas some other, like biology or some sciences, they have enormous interest among women. Lawyers and doctors, they are about 50-50 representation, but MBAs, it has been difficult to attract. So I don't quite understand whether discrimination is in MBAs but not in medical doctors or lawyers, or MIT. I know last 20 years it has been admitting 50-50, and I don't see any discrimination against anybody. So I think it is worthwhile figuring out as to what role preferences play and what role discrimination plays, and what are the consequences by way of performance or by way of risk management. I can easily imagine that risk and ethical behavior might be furthered with women for the simple reason prison population is overwhelmingly men. So maybe women are more ethical, less violent, and that might be helpful even on the board in terms of how they think. So there has to be some economic motivation and some research that is helpful. And I encourage this future generation to engage in precisely that. So, and ultimately the society might say that, well, we want certain representation notwithstanding performance, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing, that's what we are, a free society, and we as the members of the society can decide what composition we would like to see in boards, in school teachers, or in tech sector, or anywhere. So that also, so I don't have any problem with that. But I think if we are offering certain reasons as a motivation, then research can be helpful in ascertaining whether or not those reasons are reasonable and whether discrimination is playing a role, because otherwise we would be vilifying certain group of individuals for no reason if there is no discrimination. So,
thank you, Mattias.
Let me pick up on what SP was saying and comment at a slightly different angle, but I think related. So in our economic analysis of rules, we have to kind of first figure out, is there a market failure or a friction that the rule will mitigate. And by doing so, we also have to kind of survey what we call the baseline. What is the state of the world today of the markets, the current regulatory environment? So we kind of understand what any kind of new policy would do at the margin. And I think that when it comes to these diversity issues, I feel like we still don't fully understand if there is a problem. Is it due to then recruiting practices then to boards, the board nomination process that the firms on the registered side, or is it perhaps that, and I think this is what SP alluded to, is or that the pools they look at are themselves less diverse in society at large, and that could be for good or bad reasons, right? Pure self-selection, people are free to choose what they want, and they end up in certain fields and areas and accumulate the knowledge and experience that boards are looking for. They might do that in a disproportionate way, or the pools themselves might be subject to discrimination of entry and things like that, right? But so if we have a problem, I think we also need to go out and figure out what mechanism causes the problem, right? So I think as you're saying, we don't even know if it is a problem. And I'm saying, even if you think there is a problem, we need to still figure out why, like the mechanism, why it is the problem, what friction, if we put it that way, leads to this problem. And I think we still need a lot more research on that end, only even so you'll be able to interpret these kind of studies that we saw from Eileen, for example, in the last session. Like that negative performance effect was interesting, but what is it? Is it a pure, as SP said, then constraint effect? Like you just have a constraint set, so now you're forced to, we can all imagine how that can lead to suboptimal choice than if you are forced to. But it may not be. It could be it's just a trend. You suddenly forced to change the composition of the board, and there's some transition costs, right? Anytime there's turmoil, there could be costs, right? I mean, these are the things. Or is it? But it's hard to understand any kind of effect, positive or negative, or even zero effect, if you don't know the core problem we're trying, that we think these quotas or other things would address. And I still think we need more research on that kind of selection process. What flaws may there be or not be in the nomination process, for example? What pool of directors are they looking from? Is that where the fault is, or is that reasonable pools? And because the pools look the way they do, you get the boards looking the way they are, right? I still think we need much more research on that side, and including kind of there's also a two-sided matching process here, right? Just because you ask the server board doesn't mean you want to. Are there certain kind of, maybe boards are reaching out to folks that are turning them down, and why is that? Maybe they don't like the environment, there's too many old white men on the board or whatever, right? Already, so that deters. So maybe you're self-censoring yourself from going in there. I think these are all incredibly tricky questions to address. So it's a challenge to any student out there because it has multifaceted endogeneity problem involved in this, right? But I do think that before we, impose these constraints, but because they are constraints that externally imposed, we have to be sure that they are resolving the problem we think is the core problem, and that we don't get unintended consequences. For example, I mean, if you force, I think one example in that previous paper was that the effects were more negative in the mining industry, mining, construction, and manufacturing, which tend to be more male-dominated field if you look at the employees and in those fields, right? So maybe then, if we're forcing, them to choose from a pool that may not have as much on average experience as another pool, that could cause problem, right? The thing, I'm not saying that is what's going on, but I'm saying is that we have to be cognizant of these kind of issues, because otherwise I think, the unintended consequences is the thing we as economists at SE we are tasked with looking at and thinking about when doing our economic analysis. So that's always on my mind when I think about these issues.
Yeah, so I'll just add, I guess, a couple of comments. One is the research that we do, right? Instead of just sort of doing it in silos, sort of finance and accounting, and there's management and there are other disciplines, I feel like there has to be more of this interdisciplinary research to be able to tackle some of the issues that you're talking about, Mattias. And I've got, so for example, we kind of boil performance down into a few numbers. Should we be thinking differently about performance, about risk management? I think, Jeff said in the last session about find something happening with Tobin's Q or with ROI, but then you have to dig deeper and see how's the decision-making process working? What happens during a crisis period in terms of firm performance, policies of different kinds, risk management, all of that, right? So I think maybe we have to look at some of this differently. Based on my own experience on several boards, it really a lot depends on, if you don't have a single woman there, it's less likely you're going to get additional board members who are women or people of color. Once you get one, then the door opens a little bit. You get two, and the door really starts opening. So I think there are these frictions. How do we capture these frictions? I don't know. But in the real world, I do think there are these frictions that are holding things back. And just thinking of the MBA example, one of the problems is how many role models do you have, sort of women faculty teaching advanced finance and accounting courses? I do think that makes a difference in terms of how you attract women students to those courses. So lots of issues to think about. Ed, is there anything that academia could be doing that would be helpful from your point of view, from the markets, the exchanges point of view?
Let me make a couple of points. One is the SEC approval was not fundamentally based upon boards will operate better with this rule. It was based upon serving investors. It was that investors want this information. And our obligation as an SEC is to use the disclosure obligations to make sure all investors are on the same plane, get the same information, are able to evaluate, make investment decisions properly. And the information was not consistently available. And our rule will now improve the availability of the information and provide it on a consistent basis. So I think that's really important to focus on because they say that explicitly. Two is there is not an absence of research here. We submitted 20 peer-reviewed studies from the Journal of Financial Economics, Accounting Horizons, Academy of Management Review, Business Ethics, a European Review, Advances in Accounting, Contemporary Accounting Research, Gender and Management and International Journal. I can go on. These peer-reviewed studies showed positive correlation between diverse boards and the performance of companies on different measures. Now, there is imperfection in these studies, though, because for one, in some cases, as in Norway, they were studying mandates where boards were mandated. We are not mandating that you change your board. You can choose to go another path. And in fact, you may choose to delist and list on the New York Stock Exchange, which doesn't have this. So there is a need to take this new information that's available and update these studies. The SEC, to be frank, found the studies inconclusive because there were studies on both sides. But as I said, rested their case on the need for investors to get more information on a consistent basis. And the fact that this would be a minimum burden on competition and on the companies because they could choose to do nothing, but put two sentences in a disclosure saying, we don't agree. The other thing I would note is in the last 24 hours, Moody's has come out with a study and a conclusion that Nasdaq and the companies who list on it will have improved credit ratings because of this rule, because they will be more transparent, because there will be more information available about the companies who list on Nasdaq for the same issue that the SEC cited. Again, I mean, that's just a private entity's research and conclusion, but in a sense, they're putting their money where their mouth is on that. So there are many factors that could be looked into by using this data.
Thank you. Yes, disclosure is a part of the discussion that we're having here. So let me ask you, so why did you focus on this? You kind of alluded to it, but the other big topic, big issue being discussed out there is related to disclosure about E and S, right? So we talk about ESG, but there's a lot of conversation going on about disclosure about environment, disclosure about other kinds of social factors. And we chatted a little bit about this yesterday. So
it's a very good question. And the US securities laws, I love them. They're a gift to the legal profession. They are so complex. And there is an allocation of responsibilities amongst many parties, the federal government, the state government, self-regulatory organizations like Nasdaq. And there are areas in the state of Delaware plays a special role. It's a unique system, it works well, but the area in which exchanges have been, by precedent and otherwise, have been acted and have responsibilities is in the governance area. With regard to disclosures, for instance, in the environmental area and related, that is not traditionally an area where we have written rules. It is an area where the SEC has taken the lead and will take the lead, and it appears, based upon the most recent public statements. That's not to mean that we are standing idle. We are talking to our companies, we're talking to the SEC, we're talking to Congress, but this is not an area where we think we are the entity with the historical responsibility as it is in the board governance area.
Okay, got it, got it.
Well,
Going back to SP and Mattias, Ed mentioned a number of studies, and he also mentioned that the SEC saw that there were some studies showing these results and some studies showing the opposite results and something in between showing no results. What is it going to take to sort of sort this out?
It's a bit unusual that when performance is mentioned, some objection is raised, well, it is multidimensional, not performance, something else. But then when these studies, they are looking at generally performance, okay? So I don't know, I mean, we will. This is really a much broader issue. And Mattias and I, we have been saying in somewhat different terms, but I think the message is the same. So if there are frictions, if there are some barriers, if there is some discrimination, of course, we should remove that. And that can be removed, generally speaking, in one of two ways. One is through law or regulation, right? That's what, US in the 1960s, I mean, a lot of the Civil Rights Act and other things came, and through legal means, discrimination was removed. And the second is through litigation. So there are some laws that protect certain things, and then if there is some violation, then litigation is helpful. So I think here, frankly, I mean, mistreating women or minorities, that is illegal for a long time in the US. And if that was going on in spades, we would have seen a lot of litigation. And that would have, but maybe there are barriers, and maybe, okay. So that is one, and research could look into these issues. Second is, I think, I keep coming back to the point that I think an economic argument has to be made as to some connections to why or what is where the source of the benefit. Then that might be a more affirmative and stronger case, because right now, if you think there is a lot of benefit, all these firms, they are fiercely competitive. I mean, they are looking for every penny. People traffic people from countries illegally to make few bucks. So people have no morals, nothing when it comes to money. They have, and here we are saying there are legal ways, and we are leaving money on the table, and because somehow we don't want to hire minorities or women, and we are going to leave therefore a lot of money on the table. It is so beneficial, but we don't see. So somehow I think we have to both provide an economic argument as to where the source of that benefit is, where the friction is, and what the performance improvement. I'm going to give an example now. You look at it, many of the sports teams, they are almost, they are minority dominated, right? If there was so much discrimination against them, but they have seen that there is benefit and they are hiring them. So either there isn't any discrimination, or they see the benefit in that and they hold their nose and do it. But whatever it is, the outcome is very different. So therefore, it seems to me that in our board, we will have to explain intuitively as to what is the benefit that we are willing to forego and embrace so much of discrimination, or is it preferences, is it some, and perhaps there is a bit of both in all of these things, or a bit of all of these things. But I think research can really help, and that will help, be it Nasdaq or anybody or SEC, it would help in convincing what needs to be done.
There's a question from Jeff Coles, and Ed, this is for you. Under what conditions should Nasdaq or will Nasdaq, with the approval of the SEC, remove a listing requirement? Does that happen?
We update our listing requirements, frankly, the rule book has gotten thicker through the years, not thinner. One huge event was the Enron collapse in terms of generating Sarbanes-Oxley set of laws. The financial crisis had an impact in terms of investors. If a rule is not achieving its desired purpose, but remember here, I respect what SP said. He mentioned litigation and regulation affecting change. There's another factor. It's called investors voting with their feet. And if they don't like the way the board looks, they may not invest. And that may affect the board and the decisions it makes. And if the investors are empowered, and I think the issue the SEC focused on is a lot of institutional investors have this information because they meet with the management, because they have more intimate knowledge about companies and their operations, but average investors don't. And the SEC approval is based in part in empowering average investors to make decisions based upon complete information, which I think is hard to argue with.
Actually, it was an area that I was going to mention as for potential research is the whole area of proxy voting. So now that there is more disclosure about some aspects of S and G based on this NASDAQ proposal, then so as Ed is saying, if there is more information available, then are investors going to use this and vote differently? And I think the whole proxy voting on these issues, it'll be interesting to see if that changes in some form or shape. I ask the audience, please go ahead and put in questions.
I do 100% agree, and you're absolutely right. Litigation and I mentioned regulation and investor preference, and earlier comments also when I had said, ultimately we all, what the society wants, what investors want, that's what in a democratic free society, that's ultimately their interests and their, we elect representatives to enact what our preferences are. So I totally agree with you on that. I mean, that if investors, if that's what we want, well, that's what, they will. If they want all women, all men, all whatever diverse board, whatever is, that ultimately is the decision of investors. I think the point we were trying to make is that, if there are frictions, we should try to overcome those, and we should try and understand what those frictions are.
Yeah, so another question in the chat is, do you expect a lower number of firms to be listed on NASDAQ following this disclosure requirement? And would it help to study how the number of listed firms broadly depends on the exchanges and exchanges listing requirements. And this is obviously very much tied to all the cross-listing literature. Why do firms from other countries list in the US? And, even though the US might have higher listing standards, but still there are companies who want to come and list here and abide by those. But Ed, I'll let you answer your comments on this.
Well, I'll say a few things. One, this was controversial. Two is we didn't do it to attract listings. Three is, though, and this is indisputable, we're in the midst of a year in which we've had more new companies list on Nasdaq than at any other time in the last 20 years. We've had almost 500 new companies list with Nasdaq this year. We've gotten 80% of the new listings in the United States. There are probably a few companies that didn't list with us because of this rule, but we do know there are a few companies who listed with us because of this rule, who told us that's why they wanted to come list with us. And lastly, we know companies are adopting these disclosure rules even before they are required. And even if they're listed on the New York Stock Exchange, they're adopting our matrix and disclosing this, which to me indicates that the pressure is not coming from the law, but it's coming from their own investors, that they want this information, and we have given them a convenient way to display it. And so companies are already adopting this.
Let me open it up more broadly and ask Mattias, what are issues that you are working on where in the broad area of governance and disclosure and conflict of interest, that's sort of the title of our panel, that you would find it helpful for people in academia to be working on?
Yes, so obviously I can't get into any details here, but I can say in general, obviously, if you look at the published agenda for the coming year, rulemaking agenda that the chairman published publicly, there's going to be a lot of what I think potential disclosure rules in the general ESG sphere of things. But I think one thing, and I want to piggyback on what Ed said about some do it voluntarily already, right? And I think this is where I would like to understand better. More research on those that are currently voluntarily disclosing certain items that are demanded by at least some sections of the investor community. So why are some disclosing climate risk elements already? Why are some disclosing human capital metrics that are beyond what the law requires, etc., right? And I think to understand this kind of self-selection of the current voluntary will help us understand there's obviously some cost benefit calculation going on within the firms, right, when they do this. So by understanding who thinks it's beneficial versus those that they evidently think it's not, and see if there are different characteristics and other, between those two populations, you might give us a clue to whether any rulemaking, say, is necessary. B, if we do it, what are the potential negative effects? Because we know the ones that are currently are not providing these, and perhaps a little bit why if we do it more systematically in research, right? And I do think that we look a lot at the outcomes currently of, these are the, the correlations between climate risk disclosures and performance. But you do it without taking into account that it's a voluntary exercise. So I find that this kind of first stage choice of disclosing or not, I find that we ignore that. I like that to be taken much more seriously in research before we go on to look at the outcomes of the disclosure, because that tells a lot of the story, I think, and the lack of rigorous research on that particular question is kind of makes it a little harder for us than as policy economists to figure out what's really going on and to what extent the rulemaking then the mandated disclosure, for example, would actually have beneficial effects. Because it is a little puzzling sometimes why, because you say this, investors can vote with their feet if you don't disclose this. You have this other governance mechanism that you can impose to some firms through currently already. So why isn't that happening? And is it just, so it could be that managers of the non-disclosures are just, they have some private reasons, so it's an agency problem, or it could be some other real concerns they have that would actually affect It could be competitive concerns that they reveal proprietary information and things like that. And I think I find that it's sexy to go directly to the outcomes, but I want to understand better of the process, how we get to those outcomes. And as an economist, I think that's really what we need to understand better before we kind of interpret, make policy choices based on the observed outcomes alone.
Since we do have conflict of interest also in our panel's title, I'm going to ask the three of you, what do you see as the major conflict of interest issues that need to be addressed? Obviously something like payment for order flow with the whole Robinhood issue that has come to the forefront. What are that, if you want to elaborate on that, or any other conflicts of interest issues that need to be examined, should be examined, how they should be examined, your thoughts would be appreciated.
Can I say something okay, it's not going to be controversial, but whenever we get petitions, whatever they come from, for rulemaking stuff, I think we have to understand that these are not necessarily unbiased, benevolent petitions, right? So there are conflicts of interest in asking for stuff from us as regulators too. And I think that's something that needs to be recognized. I know that was not exactly what you were asking for, but I think, and this is actually, I want to make an appeal here. When we do a rulemaking, there's a notice and comment process. So after the proposal is out there, we have a comment period. I would like less, what I would say, biased folks like in academia to take a look at the rulemaking, take a look at economic analysis, and provide try to understand the rule first before you do this, because otherwise it can go wrong. But try to provide comment to us on what would be, what do you see are the costs and benefits of what we're proposing, and what do you think are more stuff we should do on economic analysis? Because I do think that a lot of what rulemaking, who shouts the loudest might actually, be listened to, and it's not always the best case. So there are conflicts of interest in among petitioners too for rulemaking. So that's like my personal appeal and my personal opinion. But I will let the other two talk about more specific conflict of interest in actual financial markets. So since we might have rulemakings from that, I want to stay away from that.
I think the whole field of corporate finance in last 4 decades, at least 3-4 decades, or 5 decades even, has been focused on reducing conflict of interest, or what contracting technology can be there. It recognizes that there is conflict of interest, and B, then what can be done to reduce that. And payment of order flow, I mean, clearly the citadels of the world might be giving some money to Robin Hoods of the world. And in exchange, Robin Hoods of the world are channeling the order flow to those big brokerage firms, right? Or trading firms. Is that a conflict of interest, or is that an intermediary receiving some payment and then intermediary passing on that benefit to the ultimate user? That is at the heart of the issue. And if we think that Robinhood is able to corner this money, then it has to have some market power, right? Now, what we know is retail investors do not have market power, and that's what makes us think that Robinhood might be able to benefit from this. So let us stipulate that Virtus or others, they benefit to some extent, and that's why they are willing to pay for order flow to Robinhood. The ability of Robinhood to retain that and not pass it on to the end user is predicated on whether or not Robinhood faces competition in the marketplace. So I think in all of these things, we have asked, well, is there a market structure that will solve this problem, that appearance of conflict of interest? Or as Mattias earlier was saying, is there a market failure? Meaning thereby, do we not have competitive structure, and therefore we have to have some regulatory solution. And so my temptation always is to try and design or work toward creating a structure that is competitive, that will solve the problem rather than have the regulation. Now, in some cases, there is no way out and you have to have regulation. But here, at least, it seems to me that market forces are going to be at play. But that said, research is called for, and that's what research is going on about. Is there what is the execution with and without market payment for order flows and things like that, right? So what is the price improvement? Are they getting it or not? How much are they getting? Is someone pocketing too much without, meaning thereby sacrificing the interests of the retail investor?
One area that's receiving a lot of attention that might be fruitful for more research is the SPACs and the management of those vehicles, if you will, and the conflict with investors, the rewards they get compared to investors. There is focus, frankly, on our part and on the SEC's part in getting more disclosure out around that. But because it's a fairly new phenomenon, my sense is more research there would be helpful. And I just want to underscore what Mattias said about participating in the SEC process. I've never seen another government agency that gives more attention to one well-written letter than the SEC. If you write a well-reasoned letter, particularly if you back it up with analysis and research, they will deal with it if it's part of a rulemaking record, and you will not be ignored. And you will impact the debate on public policy. And you don't have to be just associated with a large institution. They deal with the public's comments on a very even-handed way, particularly if there's if thought is put into it. It's kind of an encouraging aspect of our government.
To reinforce that point, I mean, I was struck during my 2 years how many staff members were engaged in reading and addressing literally every paper. Once it is open for comment, then all the comment that were received, and you know, some of the lawyers and others, they used to throw a fit saying that, oh my God, we might be ignoring some. We cannot do that, you know. So there was, because, you know, there was sometimes in the impression that, okay, we have the general tone of it and all that, and let us move the process forward. And I said, no, we can't do that, you know. And I admired that. I really admired it, the integrity of that staff and how much attention. So to Ed's point, it's really good to see, comforting to see that some of these regulatory agencies they pay so much attention to it. I felt good about it. Yeah.
So, but to close off with sort of a broad issue, and Crystal is raising this, is you know, the U.S. Markets were always seen as extremely competitive and well designed, and the envy of the world. And so Crystal is asking, so the US used to be the leader in setting financial regulation and rules, and then other countries would follow suit. But now issues related to ESG, for example, or GDPR, for example, it's happening more in Europe than the US. What are your comments on that?
Okay. Can I just say that maybe it's not us falling behind but others catching up? I would say that in general, we probably have the best regulatory environment for securities markets. It's backed also not just by, I think, pretty well written legal framework from the Exchange Act and Securities Act and Investment Act. I mangled the names, but you get it. But it's also an enforcement component to it that I think that have much more bite than in most other countries in the world, right? So I think that combination, and we also have to realize we don't just have the federal government, we have the state governments too, and they have been allowed to experiment on their own end because of a lot of the corporate law, of course, is all of it is state-based, right? So I would say that in terms of governance, yes, could it be that we need more disclosure and all of that? Yes, but I think in general, we have a combination of regulatory, federal and state, the enforcement, the lawsuit component too, that is much more active, I would say, in America, because the consequences of lawsuits tend to be higher here. There are bigger awards, etc. So you have all sorts of disciplining mechanisms already in place in America, in a combination that has been tried now for some 70, 80, whatever it is, years, 90, I guess, almost at this point in time. So I would say it's more of we don't start from the same baseline, I guess is what I would say. Doesn't mean we can't do more and perhaps should do more in certain areas, but at this framing that we are lagging behind, I don't buy. I think it's the rest of the world is catching up. It'll be interesting to hear Ed's comment on this.
Well, what I look at is the equity investment by individuals. So in Europe, my statistics may be out of date, but it's, I think, somewhere in the 20 to 30% people entrust their savings into equity investments. In the United States, it's like 50%. That is a key characteristic that helps deliver deep, liquid capital markets in the United States. We embrace taking risk. Part of this is cultural, but part of it is the confidence that the public generally has in these markets. That confidence can be lost. And we came close to it with the Enron MCI issue, and we made changes to boards then. And I want to tie it back to what we are trying to do with our responsibility in the area to oversee boards, is that we think about the economic impact, we think about the investor impact, but we think generally about the concept of confidence and investor confidence. Independent directors, it's hard to prove that they necessarily improve the performance of public companies, but they certainly give the public more confidence in the whole structure of public companies by knowing that a majority of the board members have to be independent.
Enforcement and protection of minority shareholders, I think those have been, in addition to a lot of regulatory innovation, trying to keep up with how the market is evolving technology-wise. So US has been at the vanguard in enforcement in terms of protection of minority investors and also in the regulation. Regulatory matters, not overreaching for regulation. So those have been the cornerstones of US markets. And that has, along with many other things, we can talk about education and in the entire society, wealth is a lot more in the US, and that helps make the markets far more liquid. The fact that we have 50% folks investing in equity markets, that is as much a reflection of good corporate governance, all this, the factors that we have talked about, but it is also a function of wealth. I mean, there is a lot more wealth people do have. They are employed and they have their 401ks or whatever, and then that gets invested. So US has an enormous edge. We have much to be proud of that. And it will continue for foreseeable future. At the same time, I mean, what we have to guard against is that as regulation has to be in line with what is demanded, what is required in the marketplace. If we try to, because of our passion or our certain objectives, if we try to overdo it, that can have negative consequences. Just as if we underdo it, it can have negative consequences. So it is that's the part that we have to guard against and resist the temptation also, in the interest of, it might be well-intentioned certain things. So one last point I will make, and then I will stop, and which is that there are certain things that we want as a society, we want, but let us not put all of that burden on corporations. So I always use the example of child labor or Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right? Corruption. These things got rid of because law. We didn't make that a burden of an individual company, but we made it a burden of the entire society, not burden. It's in fact matter of pride for the entire society, and passed laws against that. And we should, because otherwise it's corporations are, we are expecting them. There always will be some other corporation that is trying to cut corners and engage in that. So we should ask some of these things, are they best done by individual corporations, or are they best done by laws against that? And the SEC or others, they just do the enforcement.
Great. On that note, I am noticing that we are at 2:32 and folks have to get to other places. SP, Mattias, Ed, thank you so much for this discussion. And again, thank you to our PhD students. You're going to be doing great work, and delighted to have you. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, colleagues.
Thank you so much.